All right, all right. We don't want to keep folks waiting any longer. Good evening to everyone joining us today. Happy Alumni Week, and welcome to the Minority Alumni Coalition's presentation, Diversity Matters, a fireside chat about the push for diversity, equity, and inclusion in the sports, tourism, and hospitality industries. My name is Zach James. I'm a 2008 Sport and Rec alum and co-founder of the MAC, and I'm glad you all could join us this evening. A few housekeeping items I'd like to go over with you all. Please note this event is being recorded and will be available for playback on the STHMAA MAC YouTube page and the Connections platform. We are looking forward to an inspiring conversation between two industry juggernauts who could easily fill a 2-hour session, but we do plan to leave 10 to 15 minutes at the end for a few questions. We may not be able to get to them all, but please place any questions you have today in the Q&A function below. And before we introduce our guest this evening, a big heartfelt congratulations to both the classes of 2020 and 2021 on behalf of the Alumni Association and the Minority Alumni Coalition. So, without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to a man who has impacted countless STHM alums, the one and only Mr. Greg DeShields. Greg is the Executive Director of Tourism Diversity Matters, and he is a qualified tourism hospitality and academic professional certified hospitality educator, proficient in developing and implementing plans, strategies, and initiatives specifically designed to raise a destination's image for diversity and multicultural travel. DeShields is also an experienced certified diversity executive with demonstrated cultural competence who is prepared to strategically position any organization to remove systemic barriers to inclusion, lead cultural change, and transform brands. With that, I pass it over to Greg to introduce our special guest for this fireside chat, Mr. Eliott L. Ferguson II. Hand it over to you, Greg.
Thank you so much, Zach, and all of my STHM Temple family. It is wonderful to once again to be here with you. I also want to ask you, Zach, can I drink out of that bottle that's on the table? Because
if you can reach it, go for it.
I also would like to do a shout out, and I know there might be some other folks that I'll miss and I'll maybe pick it up later, but I noticed that Andrew's in the room, Rick Rydell is in the room, and of course, the one and only Jeff Montag is in the room. So hey to all of you. Deshaun is in the room, as well as Kenny Johnson, who's a board member for PHL Diversity and Tourism Diversity Matters own Deidre Mills Hall is in the room. So I thank all of you for joining us today. And I'm excited to be able to have this conversation with Eliott, because as it relates to an incredible leader who has certainly made a significant impact in our industry throughout his career, this kind of conversation is one that's just natural and quite comfortable. And I have to be honest with you, Eliott serves as our chair for Tourism Diversity Matters. So quite honestly, whenever you have an opportunity to bend the ear of the chair, you want to do that. So I'm excited to have that kind of conversation. Let me get right into it by reading just a quick introduction from Eliott's bio. So Eliott Ferguson serves as the president and CEO of Destination DC. It is the official destination marketing organization for Washington, DC. A 30-year veteran of the travel and tourism and hospitality industry, Eliott leads Destination DC's efforts to generate economic opportunity for the district through meetings, conventions, and tourism, overseeing the organization's focus around convention and tourism sales, marketing, finance, and business development. Eliott was the national chair of the board of directors for U.S. Travel Association from February 29 through February of 2021, where he guided the board in the association efforts to advance policies that facilitate more international and domestic travel. He is currently chair of the compensation committee. And of course, in January of 2021, he was named board chair of Tourism Diversity Matters. Yay! And we are an organization that is focused on creating diversity, equity, and inclusion opportunities at all levels of workforce in the tourism industry. You know, Eliott has been instrumental in advancing conversations about race and racism throughout the hospitality industry. As the tourism industry grapples with the 2019 pandemic, Eliott has been focused on strategic recovery with many organizations throughout DC and nationally. He serves on a variety of different boards, as well as a member of a number of organizations throughout the tourism and hospitality industry. But I think one of his most notable and most admirable aspects is that he is married to Talisa Villa, who is also a hospitality veteran, and they are longtime residents of Capitol Hill. He is an extremely active partner in a variety of educational arenas, as well as Alpha Phi Alpha fraternity and Delta Sigma Pi. So there's a lot of great things that he has done, but I think it's more about getting into the conversation. So Eliott, welcome. And I'm so glad to be able to have this fire chat with you.
You know, Greg, thank you so much. You know, there's no way that anyone can feel young when you start referencing all the things that someone's done. And you said that was the abbreviated version of that. So I don't know if that was the case or not, but happy to be here. Anything Greg DeShields asks me to do, I'm definitely going to do it. So thank you very much for this opportunity, Greg.
So I'm going to jump directly into it because we have some burning questions for you. You and I are going to be in conversation until about 6:15. We can stay on script or we could go off script, whatever is more comfortable for you. But I think we'll start with probably one of the most burning questions that people entertain conversation about today. Why is diversity, equity, and inclusion so important in the sport, tourism, and hospitality industries?
Yeah, I just feel that it's so important simply because we represent so many aspects of tourism and sports, you know, be it on the field or whatever discipline of sport you might be playing, or in a variety of other capacities. And quite frankly, the economic impact of the diverse community is pretty profound. And I think that as we look at, you know, one thing for sure is that, you know, I look at diversity, equity, and inclusion so differently than I look at the opportunity for us to grapple with the Black community, and I'm sure that might be one of your questions later, but Black Lives Matter. And I separate the two simply because one is tied to what are we doing in terms of making sure that there are opportunities for individuals to progress within industries, and the other is, quite frankly, focusing on a lot of other specifics as it pertains to the Black community, which you and I both happen to be a part of. So as we talk about the diversity within the industry, the one thing we know for sure is that the diversity stops at, if you're looking at a pyramid, maybe the first or second rung, and then it becomes fewer and fewer people of diverse backgrounds in the C-suite, if you will. And that's what this is all about. One, making sure that those that are entering the industry remain engaged enough and feel like there are opportunities to move forward. And then two, making sure that those that are in these positions understand the importance of diversity in so many different ways.
Right. You know, before I get into other questions, Zach did give me a little bit of latitude for follow-up questions. And I know that as such an important part of our conversation today, I'd be remiss if I didn't put it at the front end of our conversation to talk about the development of the Black Leaders Open Letter to the Industry that we did last year. Can you talk about that? Because that was such a pivotal moment and made such a significant statement in our industry.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll apologize in advance. There's no easy way to answer everything that Greg's going to ask me without a long explanation. So my wife tells me I'm long-winded, but this is important, and I want to put it all in perspective. So, you know, I think, you know, as I've been in the industry for 30 years, you know, I think about all the things that I was taught in terms of entering the corporate world. One, for sure, is that I am clearly going to be a minority, and that has been the case, be it entering the industry first position, whereas I was the first Black person that was not working in the mailroom in the company, and includes the fact that I'm the first Black chair of the U.S. Travel Association. How could that be in 2000 anything that's the case? You know, we were all taught to pay our dues, to act a certain way, to react a certain way, to not step on too many toes because we don't want to be disruptive, and especially if we want to progress within our careers. I think last year was pivotal for me in so many ways, and those that wrote that co-signed on the letter, because it was kind of a wake-up call that we have continued to progress within the industry where so few have. And we need to take this opportunity to, one, focus on how we all felt as it pertains to being Black in the hospitality industry, as well as what 2020, be it the senseless murder of George Floyd, as well as so many others, and not just in 2020 and beyond that, and to really speak our truth and to be a part of the conversation that is somewhat comfortable for some people and a lot more uncomfortable for others. Uncomfortable for me to speak my truth in terms of things that may have happened to me as a Black person in the industry and growing up, as well as exposing others. And the same thing as it pertains to primarily the white community, to understand some of the dynamics of how you might have come to some of the decisions you made in terms of how you perceive the Black community. The fact that you see me and Greg a certain way because you see us in a suit and we talk in a way that makes you feel comfortable. But what happens when you see Greg or me walking down your street at night and it's dark and you just see a Black person? You automatically may react differently. So the letter was an opportunity for us to be more purposeful in terms of understanding our place as it pertains to being a part of the conversation, but also recognize that as we're looking at Generation Z and millennials, which are the largest part of the workforce, and we looked at what was happening in America last year, that it was not just Black people that were on the front lines. And to get my white counterparts that lead most DMOs and play a large role in the hospitality industry to understand that this is not just a Black thing and that this is something that's important to these generations. It was important to my generation, even though I may have been more marginalized in terms of how I dealt with it. And now it's time for me to be a leader in this conversation.
Wow. You know, as a point of reference, we were talking about the letter and some of the folks who signed it. I know there are two people who signed it who moved to president's roles with other CVBs as well.
You know, that's absolutely right. And I mean, I think that it's one of those things, whereas if I were Latino in this industry, I'm probably going to vacillate towards conversation with other Latinos in terms of how I feel or venting about being marginalized. And this was an opportunity for us to get together and say basically how we felt and be emotional about it. And, you know, to your point, some of those that signed off on the letter were, you know, have now moved into other roles, notably Cleo Battle, who was the #2 in Louisville, now is going to be the #1 there very soon. And Charles Jeffers, who he and I worked together at the Atlanta Convention Bureau quite a few years ago, that was the #2 in Baltimore, is now the #1, the CEO of the Bermuda Convention Bureau, which is where he's actually from. So we are seeing progress, but you know, the reality is there's 700 DMOs and they're less than 11 that happen to be Black. And that number is even fewer when you look at the number of females that are, you know, in terms of leadership. Mm-hmm. So there's progress, especially with those that played a role in writing the letter, but there's so much more that needs to happen.
You know, it was funny as I was thinking about that, kind of reflecting on the letter being written, that if that letter was written 25 years ago, how vulnerable we all would have been. And the fact that the letter was written and almost a year later, two have moved to new CEO roles shows that we do have some advancement. But it is true that if we wrote that letter 25 years ago, we probably all would have been facing short-term opportunities with our employers.
No, I mean, we would have been fired. I mean, 20 years ago, while I was just starting here, leaving Atlanta, and as pivotal as Atlanta was in my career, and I have lots of good memories, I also think about, you know, the things that I said or didn't say, or times where I should have said more. And I think that that's, you know, as you talked about the laundry list of things I've done, I'm like, well, hell, I'm 55 years old now. I'm in a different phase in my career. I'm not, I don't react the same way that a 35-year-old me would have done, or a 25-year-old me would have done. And at the same time, I would not have gotten the support of the Black community because everybody would have been fearful of losing their jobs. And that is a part of what we're talking about today. Whether I'm talking to 2,500 associates with Delta Airlines, which I did recently, is to make sure that no matter what position you're in, you should feel empowered to have a conversation that is pivotal in terms of being able to move forward within the organization. I don't like my employees to feel like I'm saying one thing to them, but I'm totally out of touch with what their needs are. And so therefore I am vulnerable quite often, well before last year, in terms of saying to them, let me just be clear, I don't know every one of your needs. And I'm probably not going to be able to meet all of them, but I'm going to do my darndest to be the best leader I can and to offer you the best opportunities here as a part of this organization. And that's really what it's all about, empowering people at whatever level, or giving them the chance to look at it and say, you know what, this is not where I want to be, because they don't recognize the things that are important to me, and to leave. I was talking to a lieutenant colonel of the Air Force today, Jason Harris. He's about 15 years younger than me. He's a pilot with American Airlines. And we were literally talking about some of the things he experienced in the Air Force. I was in the Air Force. We were taught to stay in our lane. We were taught to be to do these things, which are very much so the way in which Latino, Black, and other minorities were taught in terms of going into white America, and how we're now in a position where we need to be more purposeful and correcting and really forgetting some of the things we were taught so that we could be better leaders moving forward.
So I have 2 other DEI questions, but I had a list of 5 questions. Like, if you ever get a chance to do a fireside chat with Eliott, you have to ask him these questions. So aside from the 2 that I've already asked you, the third one is, listen, you were the chair of US Travel, you're still on the board, you lead the compensation committee. The industry has faced devastation with the COVID-19 pandemic, the economic slowdown. It's been equated to about 9 times worse than what we experienced through September 11th. So I think it's really, appropriate at this time to maybe make a segue and talk about the recovery of our industry. And can you give some insights of what the impact was, and quite honestly, what the way forward looks like?
Absolutely. To put it in perspective, it was devastating. I mean, I've lived in DC. I moved here in December 2001, right after 9/11. So I've lived through 9/11, I've lived through sniper, anthrax, 7 government shutdowns, and of course the insurrection of January the 6th. All reasons why people either question the safety of being in Washington, DC, and or with the pandemic totally shutting down the industry globally. And I think that's the key word, whereas the things I just referenced were things that either happened in DC or in a few cities, whereas this has been global. And I think the economics tied to the loss of the number of jobs lost, the overall economic loss to the city, the $8 billion that this industry normally generates for Washington and 90,000 jobs in a city that only has 700,000 people has been enormous. We all went through phases. One, I was in denial, oh, this is not going to happen in the US, as I was traveling up through March of last year. This is going to be similar to some of the other unfortunate things, where it's going to happen in that country and not hurt us. And then we all went to, the shock of it happening, and, watching Mark Cuban in Texas when he got the news that the season was basically over for the Dallas Mavericks. And then things started shutting down. So then we went from shock to fear, from fear to, okay, now we've got to dust off and figure out how do we make our way out of this storm. And the reality for all of us is that there was no playbook. With all the other things, there have been instances where those things have happened, if not in the US, somewhere in the world. But this clearly is not one of those things. So it's all about now where we are, which is recovery, trying to focus on maintaining throughout the lean months. 80% of our budget is tied to hotel tax, which was not happening. Talking to my peers, Greg Karen in Philadelphia, Martha Sheridan in Boston, Fred Dixon in New York City, and Al Hutchinson in Baltimore, and us commiserating and talking about how do we continue to navigate, take care of our team, pay our bills, try to focus on making sure that people are safe in terms of not getting COVID, and trying to make sure that we are positioned to be able to do our jobs once we see light at the end of the tunnel, which is kind of where we are now. So it's been detrimental, but it's also been global. And it's, there's no part of the world that has not been affected by this pandemic. And, I had a conversation on Monday leading the topic of recovery and things we're doing now. And I said, here's my disclosure, my disclaimer. Whatever I say to you on Monday might change by Friday based on where we are in terms of opening, where we are in terms of things happening from the perspective of what I don't know today. And that's the interesting thing about where we are in terms of leadership, is that we're working on leading without actually having the data, the historical data, or the knowledge to know exactly where we're going to go. Even as the mayor opened us up a little bit more a couple of days ago, there's still that fear factor of, well, what happens if in 3 more months we have to shut back down again, which is very scary. So it's been a lesson in understanding the dynamics of being nimble and having a plan, but also having a backup and being prepared to throw out the playbook and just play by ear and try to make things work.
Wow. Thank you for that insight. I know as it relates to our industry, we're all excited to see people get vaccinated. We're going to encourage as many of the Temple alum to get vaccinated, and anybody that tell them to get vaccinated. And if you're in Philly, you should be definitely connected with the Black Doctors Coalition and the amazing Dr. Alice Stanford and the work that she's been doing. All right, so this is my self-serving moment, and I think Mike Gamble has texted me 10 times to say, ask him this question. Eliott, why did you accept the invitation to be board chair of Tourism Diversity Matters?
Really, and I mean, I've said this several times, it's really because of all that Mike Gamble has done well before 2020 to focus on diversity within the industry, as well as what you do, Greg. I mean, when he told me that you're coming on as the executive director, I've known Greg since his Temple days, and I'm embarrassed to say, proud for you guys, that we had more Temple grads intern with Destination DC and subsequently get jobs here because of Greg than we had at other schools, even in our own backyard. And I know that you're passionate about what you do. Going to leaving Temple, going to your next role, I knew that you were going to be a force to be reckoned with, and you were a leader. So as I ended my stint as chair of U.S. Travel Association, but was concerned that this conversation needed to continue, I was talking to Mike. Mike was calling me. He's always been proactive in terms of understanding the need to have more diversity so that he can hire CEOs in positions within the DMO space. So the dynamic duo of Mike and Greg was a shoe-in for me to come into this role and to be the chair, but also listen to those that were really instrumental in putting this together and seeing that we're truly going to make a difference as we move forward in this important topic.
Great. So I want to dive into a particular subject around diversity, equity, and inclusion, because so often when we talk about diversity, it immediately goes to race and ethnicity. And there's really dimensions of diversity. So we're diverse in so many ways, from lifestyles to abilities. How can we expand our minds on what diversity is and be more accommodating?
Well, I think the key thing is, I try to start off any conversation by humbly saying, I'm a Black man in Black America, but it does not mean that I know every single thing or aspect of what it's like being Black in America. So I learn every single day. And I think that by saying that, that's an opportunity for people to understand that even though I'm leading a lot of conversations, I'm learning so much more about what's important to other facets of the diaspora as we talk about diversity. I always remember about 10 years ago, I heard a female comedian that was in a wheelchair. She says, I'm Black, I'm disabled, and I'm a lesbian, and I'm female. And she dropped the mic and rolled herself off the stage, and people just clapped. But the message was, it's harder for her because she is a minority in every single category. But it's not just the M-word minority, which most of us hate, but it's understanding how she has been marginalized because of these things, but also recognizing that I can never see life through her eyes. And I think it's important that as we have these conversations, we come together and, we don't get too caught up on, oh my God, he used the word minority or, person of color, because there's so much of that right now. But understand that we're still learning as we move along and in this conversation. And with that, as we talk about ethnicity and lifestyle, there are things in which I've learned because I've traveled as a child. My father's from a different country. I know for a fact that there are Black people in America that are not American, that happen to be Black, that are not necessarily wanting to be recognized as African American. And these are things in which we talk about as we truly understand the melting pot of the D word, diversity, and continue the conversation. And then, of course, lifestyle plays a huge role in it for a variety of reasons that perhaps I can lend some level of conversation or know-how, but I'm more interested in others that live a lifestyle that perhaps I am not as familiar with, because I need to learn as well. So there's no such thing as there are experts on in terms of understanding diversity, equity, and inclusion. But I always say, unless you walk in the shoes of a female, you don't know what it's like to be a female, or any other person, or any other lifestyle, or sexual orientation. And these are things in which we continue to focus on as we navigate. And the irony of all of that is that all these different things, all these different aspects of people and diversity and the diasporas all exist within the hospitality industry. But unfortunately, we don't take enough time to really focus on or break down the dynamics of the various groups.
I want to lean into that conversation a little bit more, but, we have an audience of hospitality, tourism, sport, and through the role that you serve with Destination DC, you cover all of that, especially on the sports side. So I wanted to get some of your thoughts around what have you noticed in the sport or in the travel industry about organizations that have these DEI initiatives? And, how are these initiatives? Are they effective? Are they not effective? Or, what do you think they could do better?
Yeah, I would say that some of them they skim the surface in terms of truly understanding the importance of diversity, equity, and inclusion. I've said several times, I feel like a lot of organizations check the box. And I think part of the challenge for us is to ask the question, how many people that are responsible for DEI within your organization actually have access to the CEO? And if they have access to the CEO, can they truly and honestly speak to that person about the dysfunction, if it exists within that organization, without fear of retribution? So I feel like there are a lot of organizations that check the box. I feel that a lot of them are now thinking about it through a lens, whereas we need to help guide them, because a lot of people are like, well, they don't know exactly what to do as we're having this conversation, but yet they want to be in the space. And I think the one thing we know for sure is that CEOs don't like to come across as being vulnerable, which I personally feel is a mistake. And that's another conversation for another time. And by saying that, they don't want to bring up topics and subjects on things in which they're not knowledgeable enough to have a conversation on, if you will. And this is a good example. I can't tell you the number of CEOs, especially within the US travel space, that have come to me and said, I am so happy that you've given me an environment, or at least through leading the conversations we've had, to feel that I can be vulnerable and not feel like I'm going to be looked upon as ignorant. And that is something we've got to work on if we really want to have meaningful conversation. But I think that now more than ever, people are jumping to include DEI. And part of the goal of Tourism Diversity Matters is to make sure that they understand what is expected as they're going down that road of hiring someone or positioning their organization to have someone responsible for DEI.
We're speaking to a group of alumni and in some cases, students who are just ready to walk out of the door. And there are probably some administrative and faculty professionals who are in the space. So can you, from the perspective of a leader, talk about some of the practical understanding or interpretation when we say lead by example?
Yeah, I say that leading by example means that you have to almost, if I were a white leader, for example, I happen to also be the first Black CEO of Destination DC, a city, Washington, DC, that's always been deemed Chocolate City, which is somewhat ironic. It is what it is. I'm happy to be here, and I've been with the organization as a CEO for 10 years. I think you almost have to recognize the fact that you're not going to be the authority on everything. And I think that within leadership, there's this sense of always, dressing the part, putting on that mask of understanding and knowledge. And that's something that I learned a long time ago. That just does not work. The difference is I would not have called my CEO out when I was, the 25 years ago or 30 years ago, out of fear of retribution or losing my job. Whereas I encourage my team to respectfully call me out when I'm missing the boat. So I think, as we're looking at leadership and having this conversation, and what I feel is important, especially in this space, is to start off from a space of being vulnerable. I've asked, I'll never forget, about 25 years ago or so, I asked my boss, we were out having drinks one night, like, he's 10 years older than me. I said, when you were 15 years old, could you have brought me to your house to have dinner with you and your family? And I knew where he grew up. He grew up in rural Georgia. So I had my own interpretations of that. And he looked at me, he stopped, and he says, no, you would not have been invited. And everyone at the table just kind of like, ooh, uncomfortable. Mm-hmm. And then we started a conversation. And I said, well, why wouldn't? He says, well, my granddad was really racist. And, my dad was, kind of borderline racist, which means racist. And we had this dialogue. I said, well, how did that influence how you look at me today? He says, oh, no, I'm all inclusive, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, well, you know what? You've been great to me in my career. But let me just put it in perspective. You've been to my house 4 times. I'm a vice president. I started off as a sales manager. I know that you and the other vice presidents get together and you guys go play golf, and they're at your house, and they've been there several times. I hear it. You guys talk about it. I said, I've worked for you for X number of years. I've never been to your house. And of course, beat red. I said, now I'm not, this was an opportunity for me to speak my truth. Oh no, I'm so sorry. I want you to come. I'm like, I actually don't want to come now, but I need you to see it through my lens. And he was embarrassed, but he came to me later and said, I'm happy that you called me out on that. I need to do better. And, it was, again, we were out having drinks. I was the vice president. I'm like, well, I felt very comfortable in saying to him, I hear what you're saying, but I also see your actions. And I am not 100% sure that you see what I see as you're patting yourself on the back because I'm now a vice president, which, by the way, I earned that job. You didn't give it to me. And I think these are the things that I'm now pulling, I'm thinking back on those lessons and those conversations and how that could have really gone the other way. And if it did, I'm like, well, that's not where I should have been. But that's kind of helping me to talk to other white CEOs about how the people that work with them perceive them. And that's important that they get it, because they are all, I've always been, and I get it. And I'm like, do you? And, and that's important that we have that level of dialogue versus sitting there and smiling and saying, you have no clue. Right. And it's unfortunate, because what's happening is that their staff, people that work for them, are calling me and telling me that you've got this person talking about this subject and they are awful. They're sexist, they're, all these things. And then I go back and try to address it with that leader in a way where they understand that your team doesn't believe in anything that you're saying, and hear the reasons why.
Wow, great. All right, I want to shift the conversation to something that should be really fun for you. So for 8 years, we had this power couple in Washington, Michelle and Barack, and they left, and people were still questioning about the power couple in DC. And of course, most people say from the hospitality perspective, it's Eliott and Talisa. So this question really centers upon work-life balance. You and your wife have incredibly demanding, incredibly, consuming jobs. So can you talk about, like, what do you talk about at dinner, or like, breakfast in the morning, or how do you maintain that balance? I mean, I'm sure when her phone rings, your phone rings, or vice versa. So can you give us some insight about it? Because that is a pretty amazing scenario. Well,
one, we always laugh at anything that is tied to power and couple when it comes to us, because we are, we're good. I was not born in the South, but I feel like I'm real Southern. We're just good old Southern folks trying to get our jobs done, and we respect. She's vice president for Kimpton Hotels globally, and she does amazing work. And she happens to be on the board not because she's my wife, but because she has been very formidable and getting Kempton to focus on some of these same variables. When we're together, we are, I'm picking up dog poop, and we're doing things that everybody else does. Yes, we do talk about work, but we try to minimize that. It's been very interesting. We've been together for 21 years, married for nearly 16. We've always traveled. It's like I'll never forget the time she was in a plane and I was in the plane behind her, and we were on the phone talking. I'm like, "Does your plane take off yet?" She says, "No, we're on the runway." I was like, "I think you're in front of me." And that's kind of been our life up until the pandemic, whereas we were then forced to be around each other a lot more and learn more about each other. Our goal is this. We've been talking more about this subject more than ever. She's 6 years younger than me, and she's very empowered. She's the only Black person in leadership within Kempton. And she would have never said anything. We always recognize and acknowledge that. And we weren't proud of it, but we're now having conversations tied to making sure that we work for companies that truly understand the importance of diversity, and making sure that we are playing a more active role in that conversation. So that's what we talk about a lot. And then laugh about anything tied to power and couple, because we're just peanut butter and jelly eating people.
Very cool. So listen, once again, an audience of alumni, soon to graduate, or if not already graduated students. I mean, if you had the opportunity to be the, graduation speaker, hint, hint, STHM, if you had the opportunity to be graduation speaker, is there a singular message that you'd like to share with individuals about this industry?
Yeah, and I think about all the commencement speeches that I've heard, and I always appreciate it when it's people that are high up in, well known and what have you, because I love their speeches. But I always tell people, don't base your gauge in terms of your role models on people you don't know, because you will find that people will disappoint you all the time. I love when I hear the niceties and the great things that people say, but the thing that I say to folks is just be your authentic self. Never accept the job. As a Black person, I recognize the fact that my generation, my grandparents' generation, those were probably the first two generations within the Black community that I know that were able to get a higher education. Everyone else worked very hard and had different and did the best they could to get to where they are. And because of where they were, when I talked about leaving a job, I remember the reaction of I was fortunate enough to have my great-grandparents alive, and my great-grandparents in the Bahamas are like, "You're leaving that good job." And they were, they had their own business and they did well on their own. And I had to process that, because their perception and reality was, when you get a job that allows you to pay the bills, you don't leave that job, whether you like it or not, because that allows you to pay the bills. And to a certain extent, that was instilled in me. And that's something I had to unlearn eventually. It's like, I remember now as we hire millennials, Generation Z, and I don't mean that in a derogatory way, but that's just who we're hiring, coming in and saying, "Well, I'm going on a 6-week sabbatical because I'm going hiking, and you just finished college and you're coming into this company." And I'm like, "What? You're doing what?" That would have never worked for me. That would have never flown, that would have not worked in 1987 when I finished college going into a company. But now I've learned to appreciate that. And I've said to the older members of my team that sometimes get a little befuddled by some of the requests, I'm like, good for them for coming in and wanting a work-life balance. Good for them for wanting to be in an environment where they're contributing, they have a voice, they don't feel like they have to wait 10 years because that's what we were taught. And I said, so we have to unlearn those things. And what I say to the graduating class today is make sure you find a job or you find a career where when you get up every day to get ready for work, you may not love it every single day, especially if you're starting out, but you love that career choice and you don't get up feeling like you're going to a job that you don't want. Of course, unless you have responsibilities. I'll say to those that are graduating, and I have a niece that's graduating, and when Zach referenced it, I remembered I had to send her some money for graduation. She's finishing Spelman in Atlanta. That the world is yours, and don't accept anything less than being in a company or creating a position for yourself, whereas your voice is important from the beginning. And it does not mean that you don't understand the chain of command, because that's important as well. But everyone is important, and whatever your thoughts are, whatever is important to you, you don't have to wait until you are near retirement to enjoy life. So, that's kind of the message. Everything else is tied to what you've learned in college. University is a place where I learned a lot of textbook stuff, and then I got into the real world and I had to perform. The other part of what I learned was at home. And for me, another part of it was in the military, and all those things make you who you are today. But I will also say, don't be so bullish that you're not willing to listen as you move forward, and don't be too proud to fail, because failure is, quite frankly, a stepping stone to doing better. You don't have to wallow in failure, but you can learn a lot from opportunities or things you did that perhaps you would have done differently. And as a leader, I recognize that I fail at a lot of things, and that's an opportunity for me to learn about how to do things better moving forward.
Very cool. All right, so based on my tenure at Temple, you should receive a cap and gown acknowledging you that you passed the rehearsal as a graduation speaker, because you did it in less than 5 minutes, which we've sat through like 45-minute conversation. So that was excellent. But in the last 2 minutes that we have, I want to kind of switch it and let people get to know Eliott a little bit more. So these are just some very short questions, one answer. So what's your favorite color?
Green.
Green. What is your favorite food?
Italian, all types.
What do you drive?
I drive an Audi, except for right now I'm driving a Buick. Long story.
I have a bit of a departure, because I've been a long-term Buick guy, and because they've ended sedans, I moved to Cadillac. So I could talk to you about Buick stories if you want. And then last, what's on your playlist? Like, what do you listen to as often as you can, or what type of music?
You name it. This morning, I was in the gym and I was listening to the hip hop station, because I love the music. I don't like all the bad words. Yes, I'm old enough to still not like that. But then as I was leaving, I was listening to classical. So it really depends on my mood. And then all the music that my parents played when I was growing up that I said I'd never play is now on my playlist.
Very cool. So listen, this has been great. And in the perfect style of a moderator, we end it like at 6:15, as we promised. I know, Zach, you want to take over and do some Q&A. So Eliott, thank you so much. I enjoyed this. We have to do this again.
I agree, Greg. Thank you so much. Always a pleasure.
Indeed. Thank you both for your time, your candor. And I appreciate the questions at the end. I'm also a green guy and Italian, but I drive a Jeep. So I'm not at that level yet. But we do have some questions to ask that'll follow a lot of the themes that we've been discussing. First question I have here, what is something that can be done now in the hotel segment of the hospitality industry that can make or start to make an immediate impact in addressing the diversity issue?
Well, I would say that now more than ever, we have the ear of the CEOs of all of the major companies. And again, none of those CEOs represent any varying degree of diversity at all. There is a CEO roundtable within U.S. travel that is comprised of billion-dollar companies that I've had a chance to address, and I've had a chance to talk to them individually offline after I've addressed them. So it's a difficult question to answer, but it does start at the top. My wife's doing it with the CEO of Kimpton, specifically, and requiring him to be a part of the conversation with the few Black employees or the diverse employees in which they have. And it's part of what I'm saying to, I happen to have between Choice Hotels, Hilton, and Marriott headquartered in my backyard. And there are a lot of powerful people within those organizations that represent diversity, and some of them are on the board of TDM. And we're going to be able to pursue this agenda with their assistance. So I think TDM is going to play a big role. I think that if anyone that's on the call works for one of those companies, works for a hotel company, you should make it a point of asking to have that conversation with the CEO. I mean, the worst that can happen is the answer is no. So it's an indirect answer, but I mean, these are things in which we're working on right now as it pertains to making sure that that these priorities are met. And they all have DEI people that represent, that focus on DEI within their companies, which is a start.
Zach, I would probably add to that, certainly as a direct and immediate impact, is to look at the supplier diversity strategies of the organizations. And I believe that, one way to make a huge and immediate impact is to be much more participative in purchasing from diverse businesses. It certainly allows you to engage, not just from a commerce perspective, but you kind of build that network which is associated with those businesses. But it certainly is one area in the DEI conversation that, as you think through how can I begin to integrate it in my business, in my organization, this is certainly one that offers a very more immediate approach to make an impact.
You're absolutely right. And I think too that, as you said what you said, because I know my wife's doing a lot of that, they're being more purposeful in terms of what they're doing with minority-owned companies. It also ties into all things associated with advertising, marketing, and all those variables, and the importance of having people that represent diverse backgrounds that are part of the decision making. As we watch the TV show Mad Men in the 70s or 60s, they were all white men making decisions for women, products for women, and the list went on. And how short-sighted was that? And how many times have we seen an ad from a company, whereas they think they're patting themselves on the back because they have a diverse couple, black, white couple, and they're thinking that this is exactly what people want. And they need someone that's sitting there telling them how that's perceived by different parts of the community so that they can make sure they're hitting the mark. And unfortunately, not enough of them are fortuitous enough to think along the lines of, let's make sure that people that represent those particular diasporas are at the table so that they can give us some insight.
100%. Thank you. Another question we have: how do you effectively continue to push DEI efforts in your workplace when initial efforts are met with resistance?
And I'm sure these questions are for both Greg and I. I mean, that's a very interesting question. I mean, I had a conversation. I talked to one of my peers that represented a city, and she called me, white female, and said, Eliott, I represent a city where the mayor said he does not want Black people coming to this destination. And so she said, what can I do? I said, well, why don't you have me have a conversation with the mayor and whoever else, other stakeholders in your city, to give them some insight as to how I feel about coming to their city and the economics tied to that short-sightedness. And then she went on to further tell me that the number one attraction they had was a Confederate soldier that was a statue in the city center, and they were all proud of that. I told her, I said, maybe it's just time for you to leave. And I had a conversation with her and those folks, and they heard me, and she told me how they perceived it. They thought it was great, but they're probably not going to change anything. And I think sometimes if you don't feel that the leadership is listening to or engaged enough to listen to what you're saying, then perhaps you need to move on. And I think that's the reality of it all. I think sometimes I'm very careful as to not to tell people to go to the board of directors, but at the same time, it depends on who within the organization. If there's a person that is responsible for DEI within that organization, usually there's not a person, then you can have that conversation with that individual to get that position, that point made. But unfortunately, some people that are short-sighted in terms of their thinking, it's very difficult to change them, especially when they get to be a certain age, and that's so unfortunate.
I'll reflect back on a lot of the focus that we had in senior sim at Temple when students were interviewing with companies. It was about what's that culture fit, evaluating the culture of the organization to make sure it fits for you. I interviewed the president of Work with Gen Z, who has talked about Gen Z's natural organic connection with DEI, and that as they interview with companies and they push their DEI agenda, that is really somewhat offensive because DEI to them comes natural. So I think that's the issue of culture of an organization. And if you are in the culture of an organization that is not, that does not embrace DEI, that's a concern. And the reason is because that culture is set by leadership, and DEI does not work from bottom up, it works from top down. There has to be a commitment by leadership that in fact establishes a culture with everybody can agree to and support, because it's everyone's responsibility. And fighting up a mountain to try and change the culture can be somewhat of a challenge. I will say though, if it's where you work and you can't position yourself to depart, there are aspects of DEI within HR policy. So as you look at things like sexual harassment, or if you look at some of the other policies that are associated within an HR function of an organization, I might encourage them to gravitate that way, because you can at least address those issues as it relates to policy or laws and in that existing organization, but realize that unless leadership really buys into it and establishes a strategy to change culture, it's going to be it'll be problematic to have the kind of DEI engagement that you would like.
Yeah, Zach, I interviewed for a company in the 90s, a DMO, whereas the CEO was trying to bring me on as a number two. And after the first day, she took me to the side and said, you're the right guy for the job, and I love you to death. I know Mike Gamble probably knows, so I won't name the company. But she says, I have ownership of hotels that are racist, and they won't accept a 30-year-old you at the time, Black man, to be the CEO, to be in this role. And I said to her, I really sincerely appreciate your honesty. The next day when I went to meet with these folks, I basically said to them, I'm qualified for so many reasons, but as you're looking at me, I'm also looking at you. And perhaps this is not the culture that I want to be a part of. If the color of my skin is a problem for you, then don't consider me. And, if my age, because I was much younger than the people that they were considering, don't consider me, because I'm fine with who I am. And and that was that. But, sometimes you just have to go out on a limb and look at that culture, as Greg said, and hopefully you have people around you that are honest enough to let you know what the culture is. Sometimes you look at that and say, this is a challenge that I'm willing to accept if I'm in a position to work to change the landscape. But not everyone is. And that's why it was important for me to say, this is not where I want, you're looking at me, I'm looking at you. And this culture is not what I want. I don't need this.
I definitely appreciate that response. I think very similar to an entrepreneur who takes that leap. They don't know what the next step is. It seems similar to that you do have to rest on your laurels and actually speak up, not knowing what that result is going to be. And luckily in today's day and age, it's a little better response than it would have been 10, 20 years ago. But definitely appreciate that response and detail. And again, thank you to Johanna and Harris for your questions. We have one last question for the evening from Dorsey. What is an emerging area of sport tourism and hospitality that you would like to see more people of color involved in or leading?
That is a good question, Dorsey. I don't know if I can answer it. I will say that there are certain sports that are highly coveted that I'd like to see, like for instance, hockey, and others that are large economic engines for cities. And that, whereas when I go to a hockey game, I just don't see it. I don't see a lot of diversity there. I'm sure, Zach, since you've graduated 12, 13 years ago in sports, you probably can answer it actually better than I can, since you've had a chance to look at it through the lens of someone who has chosen this as a career. So how about that for deflecting?
If I could chime in though, before you answer that, Zach, the curriculum at STHM is really about leadership, management. And I'd be more inclined to encourage a student to, as I've said in a number of conversations about aspiring in whatever area of the industry, think of moving through the finance areas of any of those organizations, the marketing aspect of any of those organizations. I think it's more than just the idea of whatever the actual sport is, but there are some strong business related skill sets that exist within the curriculum to prepare you for a career. And I'd be more inclined to encourage someone to take that, especially on the finance side, because understanding how much money gets made and how things get paid allows you to have a better sense of how you can maneuver your way within the organization. So I'd kind of lean along that side. That's a lot of what we kind of shared when we were providing some career advice. Think of ways to infiltrate the business, because from there you have a better opportunity to kind of grow into leadership or whatever roles you may want.
Indeed, and my thoughts towards that is actually not even in the sports space. I would go towards the hospitality space and go to hotel ownership. I've had a chance to learn a lot from one of our MAC members, Kendra Plummer, whose consulting firm helps people get into ownership of hotels. And again, I know the Miss Johnsons of the world who own hotel chains, but I don't know many other minorities in that space. So I think that would be an area that I would love to see more diversity, more Black and brown people step into roles is in that hotel ownership and leadership space.
That makes sense. There are also some like Eric Moses, who's now the new CEO of the Nashville Motor Speedway, first Black person that has led a NASCAR, I think it's NASCAR, ever. And we have a Black female in Washington, D.C. that's the CEO of our soccer team at Audi Field. She's the third woman, first Black female. These are people that I would probably, if I'm specifically interested in sports, I would probably reach out to these individuals to learn more about what they have done to get to where they are as well. So.
Indeed. Again, I want to thank you both very much from everyone at the MAC. Thank you, Greg and Eliott, for your passion, your expertise, and guidance towards DEI initiatives. We do appreciate you immensely. Thank you to all our attendees. And remember, soon you will be able to watch this session back on our MAC YouTube page and the STHM Connections platform. And I really wanted to encourage you all to please continue to enjoy Temple's Alumni Week. And we really hope to see you at a couple events. As you see on my screen, on Friday at noon, we have our last MAC panel of the semester hosted by the Education Committee. This is our first event where we actually have a student moderating. My good friend Jamar Root, a rising senior, will be moderating this session about life lessons and career transition. So really poignant for those who just graduated, those who are changing professions, and everything of the sort. We have Aria Bias, class of 2012 of Porchlight Coaching, Jasmine Gordon, class of 2006 with OmniFan. We have Daniel Van Norton, class of 2013, graduate class 2016, working at the NFL. And we have Dorsey Spencer, class of 2017 at Colgate University. So an awesome panel talking about career transitions. Lena did put that in the chat for us so you can register. And then we also have later that evening our spring social, where we will be we'll be celebrating the class of 2020 and 2021. So we really hope you register for both of those. Again, want to thank everyone for joining us this evening. And of course, a virtual round of applause to our amazing guests today, Greg DeShields and Eliott Ferguson. Thank you both.
Thank you.
Thanks, Zach. Congratulations as well for starting the Minority Alumni Coalition. So kudos to you, my friend. It's been a pleasure.
Indeed, indeed. You all have a wonderful evening.
All right. See you, Eliott.
Take care, guys.